how far away from further deployment of the THAAD system in Japan? And exactly what is Japan, do you think, the Abe administration having in mind doing that?
Well, there's right now a committee in the defense sector of Japan led by Tomomi Inada, the defense minister, to see about this deployment, and I think the attitude is very positive. The essential problem with that is that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has pushed to end, he's urged the United States to end its no first strike policy. And I think the problem with that and why he's trying to acquire it is because it provides this illusion that you can launch a strike, let's say a first strike against Pyongyang or North Korea, and that you'll be able to defend yourself from the retaliatory strike. So I think this is the thinking behind why they need a THAAD system. They need something a little bit fail-safe to reassure Parliament, to reassure the defense sector and the citizens that they're safe if they attack.
Mr. Teng, though, China has been against this, of course, both THAAD system in South Korea and also in Japan. What exactly is China having in mind? Some say it does not really affect China because the degree that they deployed the THAAD system will not really violate the security of China.
Yeah, first I should say the Chinese officials in recent years have raised the tone against this program. From the ending of the Cold War, the United States actually initiated this program. They are going to deploy the missile defense system from Alaska to the Philippines. It's actually a defense link in this region, and I think this is a very important part for the U.S. military deployment in Northeast Asia and in Asia Pacific region. And I think the main purpose is to deteriorate or hurt the strategic stability among the nuclear weapon state, because of its radar system. It can give a long-range surveillance against the targets in the mainland of China and in Russia. So I think this is really a bad program for the U.S. government to have such a deterioration of the stability among the countries.
Well, so much concern, Mr. O'Hanlon, it seems, from the Chinese side, the Japan further deployment of THAAD system. So can the U.S. afford not to do that together with Japan?
Well, I think it's pretty important that we stay focused on the threat here. I think all of the countries we're talking about, China, Japan, the United States, we all recognize that North Korea is a dangerous and extremist regime. I understand we have different relationships with North Korea. I think there are ways in which China's relationship could possibly be helpful. I'm not blaming China for the fact that North Korea is unpredictable and aggressive, but let's not forget this is an extremely dangerous organization or government. And yes, there are other tensions in the region as well between the big powers that we've been discussing, and a lot of complicated history. But I don't think those kind of tensions are the same as the threat we really face in a direct, serious, acute way from North Korea. So I support missile defense deployments, because I think we have to distinguish here between long-standing tensions and anxieties that the countries like Japan and China may have about each other, and the acute threat that is real and undeniable posed by a regime like North Korea's, which is just a whole different category. So I do think that the United States owes China a fair amount of explanation about nuclear force planning, and I admire China's restraint in its nuclear force planning, and I think we should do better to show restraint ourselves. But meanwhile, I think we have to protect ourselves from North Korea.
Mr. Teng, you want to respond to what Mr. O'Hanlon talking about the so-called long-term uncertain relationship among some of the countries, namely China, the United States, China, Japan, for example, and what he called the accused threat coming from DPRK. Obviously, he's saying, well, there should be a priority. Do you think his priority is correct?
Yeah, I think DPRK did pose a threat, especially with the missile test and the nuclear test. It did give some negative impact on the regional peace and stability. But I don't think the missile system deployed by the United States only targeted at the DPRK. And this is actually a global project from the European continent. We also have witnessed the deployment of THAAD and some Patriot missile system in Romania and in Poland, and also sea-based missile interceptors. So this is actually a big program for the United States to squeeze the defense posture of of Russia and China.
Well, that's what you think about the United States. What about Japan? As we said, this is a very important player, of course, in the overall system. Japan has been investing heavily in military equipment in the past couple of years. Take a look at some of the numbers we have for you here. Earlier this year, the Japanese parliament approved the new controversial security law, allowing the country's self-defense forces more freedom in carrying out overseas operations. For 2017 fiscal year, Japan's military budget reached more than $44.5 billion US, a record high, of course, though it is hardly surprising since the Abe government has set an annual growth target of 0.8% from 2014 to 2018. Those are the numbers coming from Japan. Mr. Shimatsu, after looking at those numbers, many would wonder, what is this THAAD system's status in terms of Japan's ever-increasing interests in maximizing its defense and probably even offense capabilities?
Right. I think one of the problems Japan faces is that it lacks its own nuclear deterrence capability, and I think this is one of the reasons Donald Trump has urged Japan to do that, so that it will join this deterrent system. Nuclear deterrence did hold up throughout the Cold War. I think North Korea's actions are basically to establish itself within a deterrent system. It's not to seriously attack another country. The problem is Japan, of course, was a victim of the nuclear bombings. The public is very much against nuclear armament. So Japan, therefore, is investing in all sorts of other military technologies, conventional technologies, where it can strike back without nuclear power. And I think this is a real problem because that tends to destabilize the existing system between the great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. So I think this is very destabilizing altogether.
Well, it might be destabilizing, but of course, Japan has its own cards to play. So, Mr. Shimatsu, before I go to the other guests, I want to push you with another question, which is, Mr. Abe, the Prime Minister, is about to visit Russia, likely to have a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the 15th. Russia, of course, is also an important player in terms of opposition to the THAAD system deployment. Tokyo willing to establish a closer relationship with Russia, that's what we all know, but will Russia be able to push it hard enough, and will Tokyo be able to listen to Moscow in this regard?
Well, one of the problems is this visit was planned very early on, but their talks in September did not go very well. Russia is not too interested in returning the northern territories to Japan. So this will be a fairly tense meeting, and no one's really expecting a lot to come out of it. Now the problem is THAAD. It depends on where it's deployed, how far north that will go, whether it will interfere with Russia's ballistic nuclear capability in Siberia. A real question there. So this is kind of a wild card. Everyone's going to be watching. And the other problem is, of course, it's expensive. A full THAAD outfit with radar costs more than $1 billion, and that's more than the Tokyo government has spent on the Fukushima evacuees. So we're really hitting a point where push is coming to shove, and whichever way we go is going to be very, very decisive for stability all throughout the Western Pacific and the Northern Hemisphere.
Mr. O'Hanlon, having heard the other two panelists, I do want to ask you this question. You talk about the long term, you talk about the acute threats among countries here in Northeast Asia vis-a-vis relations with the United States. But there's one moving factor that, of course, is Mr. Donald Trump, the president-elect. Many know he is unpredictable, at least for now. So how much will what you have just said about the acute threat and the long-term threat really still, in terms of a priority, should be outlined in that way?
Well, you're certainly right that President-elect Trump is a wild card, especially in regard to East Asia. I see him trying to walk back some of his stronger campaign rhetoric in regard to NATO, for example, but on East Asia he continues to make news in regard to his willingness to challenge longstanding practices with China and others, as we heard even yesterday. So I do share some of that concern, and all I can really say to try to reassure people is a lot of us in the United States are going to be watching this very hard and trying to exercise whatever limited influence we may have to reduce the likelihood of the president-elect doing unwise things. But there is this degree of unpredictability. I fully share that concern. But I think that's all the more reason why, when it amounts to something that's fairly straightforward, protecting yourself from a real missile threat from a hostile and extremist country like North Korea, that we have to acknowledge that the United States and its allies have a reasonable case for deploying this. And yes, there are complicated matters that have to be factored in terms of the U.S., China, and Japan-China relationships. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, we really do need to protect ourselves against a regime like the DPRK's with its nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles.
Mr. Teng, the DPRK, of course, are just like us, watching very closely what Washington will come up with after January the 20th, Mr. Trump comes into power. Meanwhile, as Mr. O'Hanlon earlier mentioned, there are already strains, if I could use that word, at this moment between China and the president-elect, because he's talking about walking out of the 4 decades long existing framework. So, plus the further deployment of THAAD system, which China has originally been against, will all of these factors urge China or push China to a certain corner, the degree that China might take further actions? And China is only one of the players. What about Russia? And what about actions, reactions, Japan, South Korea, the United States? Will there be a action, reaction, ever ferocious cycle that we are likely to see?
Yeah, it's really hard to give 100% prediction on the policy adopted by the president-elected.
Right.
And, he still has at least 40 days to be the president of the United States. During these days, I'm sure he will give some test of our policy, of U.S. policy in Taiwan issue, in DPRK issue, and I'm sure in the coming days he will continue this, saying,
So the question is, Mr. Teng, if I could ask very clearly, given all of these factors, we're not just talking about that because that's only one of those factors, but all of these together, what can be China's reaction? And how can China defend itself as it sees it?
First, I should say China's policy has been there for decades, as you mentioned just now. I'm sure China is being very patient to watch the rhetorics by the president-elected. And the second factor we should think about is the Chinese side will continue the exchanges with the president-elect on any issues related to the security, to the peace in this region. This is actually a tough job for the two sides.
I understand the diplomatic part. China is doing that right now. But what about when it comes to defense? What about worst scenarios?
Yes. I think this is actually a very tough job for our PRA. And actually, in recent weeks, we have witnessed the flight training of our Air Force, just very close to the Taiwan island, and even in the South China Sea, some military drills were carried out. This is actually a signal to the president-elect that China is well determined to safeguard its sovereignty, its peace and stability, and also the integrity of the country.
Let me ask you, Mr. Shimatsu, have you heard from your Chinese colleague, also your Washington counterpart? The thing is, whether Tokyo is willing to be a card of the United States with a possibly changing policy Washington has toward Japan, does that give the Abe administration more momentum to do THAAD? And yet, doing that would invite more cautious reactions and probably stronger reactions coming from China and Russia.
Well, so far the Japanese position is to try to develop a greater independence for the United States, realizing that the United States umbrella will not be there. I mean, there's been a drawdown of U.S. forces, and what Trump is saying is that there's going to be an increasing reluctance among the American public if there is actual conflict between Japan and China. I think the larger problem is the lack of a, we have obviously a huge arms race going on in Asia, all across Asia, but there's no forum, there's no dialogue really on arms control, on reducing this arms race and determining what the rules are that everyone's going to play by. So I think right now, each side is going to try to take advantage of this vacuum right now without an international system in Asia. And that's what Shinzo Abe is doing. He's going to arm up as much as he can and build up as far as he can go.
Right, Mr. O'Hanlon, in the U.S., of course, that is only going to invite further actions coming from the other countries. Everybody going to arm themselves as much as they can, on all possibilities they can. Arms race going on here in this part of the region and will be going on in the rest of the world as a result.
No, I think you should give countries in East Asia more credit, including China and Japan. You talked earlier about some of the new Japanese defense initiatives. Japan still only spends 1% of its gross domestic product on its military.
That's for now.
And it still has substantial constraints on the use of force. Yes, for now, but most of the discussions, like the one that you had earlier in this show, forget to mention that Japan is still at 1% of GDP. They imply that somehow the shackles are off. And that's simply not true. And it's worth remembering that. It's also worth giving China credit. China, even though it's having now a substantial defense buildup and has the second largest military budget in the world, it's still spending no more than 2% of GDP on its military, and probably less by most estimates. So I want to discourage this idea that East Asia is involved in some big arms race.
Military budget is one thing, but how the money is being spent, where it's being spent is another thing. Small-scale conflicts is already going to worth a big turnout in the overall change of the world we're talking about here in our world today. So it's not just the military budget, it's also where the money is going to be used, where the focus is. So Mr. O'Hanlon, what do you think about the possibility? I mean, how to prevent that? We have already seen a possibility of arms race already going on in this part of the world. And what role will U.S. eventually play? Of course, you don't have to be responsible for your president-elect, but really, what is the role that U.S. is aspired to be at this moment?
Well, first of all, I'm going to stick with my point earlier that not only are Japan and China showing restraint in the magnitude of their defense spending, I believe they are still both showing restraint in their behavior overall. Now, yes, China is flexing its muscles in some places, but frankly, from my point of view, that's somewhat understandable for a great country that has been so peaceful for so many years and in many ways less strong than it had been historically. And most of what I see, I try to reassure my American friends, many of whom are very worried about China's behavior in East Asia, in the East China Sea, South China Sea, that yes, both countries have to watch each other and look for ways to reassure, but we shouldn't exaggerate the problem. We shouldn't convince ourselves that we're already embarked on some big regional arms race when in fact that's not the case. So you're right, there are a lot of things we have to still watch, but let's not lose perspective on where we are today.
But the role of the United States, you still haven't answered. That's exactly what I want to ask you, Mr. O'Hanlon.
Well, I think part of the answer is indeed to encourage Japan to modify its policies only very gradually and as part of a collective security system, not with the interest of unilateral action. So that basic principle I think we should try to retain.